So originally this was going to be a video on everything that happened in the world in the year 1492, but yeah, screw it, let's just do Columbus. Okay, let's get a few things out of the way here. Cristoforo Colombo, or Christopher Columbus as we call him, was born in Genoa in 1451. He was not Italian, he was Genoese. Italy didn't exist yet, it wasn't formed until 1861. Also, he didn't sail for Spain because, much like Italy, Spain didn't exist yet. It didn't take form as a unified kingdom until the reign of Charles I in 1516. He grew up around business and ended up apprenticing as a businessman, leading him to sail across much of the known world, well, at least the parts that could be reached by ship. And it was becoming more and more difficult to import spices and goods from China, seeing as the Silk Road wasn't very safe due to the fall of the Mongol Empire, as well as the rise of the Ottomans. It was a man named Toscanelli in 1470 that went to the King of Portugal and proposed an attempt to reach the Indies by sailing west, but this was turned down. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and suddenly Portugal had found that magical import from the sea route. Toscanelli ended up sending his plan to Columbus, who had already proposed a trip west, and this really got his wheels moving. He believed that the trip would be much quicker than it was in reality, mostly based on the idea that his calculations for the size of the Earth were based on measurements in Arabian miles rather than the Latin ones that he was familiar with, meaning that the world was much larger than he had hypothesized. Add to this Antillia, which was a mythical island that many believed to exist in the west between Europe and the Indies. It even showed up on quite a few maps, much like the Phantom Islands of Magda and Brazil. And no, not that Brazil, the island was an Irish myth. The actual Brazil is named after the Brazil wood that was imported back to Portugal. Now, Columbus did shop this idea around. Portugal turned him down twice, as did England, Venice, and Genoa. In 1486, he presented the idea to the rulers of Aragon and Castile, Ferdinand and Isabella. But yet again, he was turned down, though Isabella did give him a yearly allowance to keep him from taking his idea somewhere else. Columbus continued to negotiate terms for several years, and in 1492, after finally completing the Reconquista, Isabel heard him once again, and once again said no. However, her husband Ferdinand heard about the proposal and sent for Columbus to return, after which they eventually signed the capitulation of Santa Fe, where Columbus was promised the rank of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, as well as being governor of any lands he discovered. He was also entitled to 10% of all monies made from any of his discoveries. And he was granted 3 ships. We know them as the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, though we don't know the actual name of the Pinta, which means painted one by the way, and the Nina was actually named the Santa Clara, but was referred to as Nina because it was smaller than the others. They sailed out of the Canary Islands on September 6th, and on October 12th, land was sighted. By the way, Columbus ended up taking credit for the sighting of land so that he could get a reward from the crown. The land was named San Salvador. We know it was one of the islands of the Bahamas, but we're not sure which one, and he was greeted by the indigenous people. He noticed that some wore gold earrings, and some of the men had scars on their bodies, which they attributed to invasions from nearby islands or the mainland, which most likely were raids for slaves, and which made Columbus think that they would make good slave stock. He visited several islands, taking some prisoners on each, as well as prisoners of anyone he found in possession of gold, so that he could find out where they got it. He also continued establishing colonies and ended up running the Santa Maria aground on Christmas Day. The irony of that is not lost on me. He eventually came across a tribe in the modern Dominican Republic, known as the Ciguayos, who met the arriving Columbus with force, attacking them, and of course trade between the two failed. Columbus returned to Europe afterwards, first stopping at Portugal, then making it back to Spain or Castile or whatever. So at this point, let's talk about why Columbus wanted to sail off into uncharted lands, besides the pathway to China thing. We're talking the classic 3 G's here: God, gold, and glory. He wanted to spread Christianity, he wanted to make a fortune while doing it, and he wanted to be known as the man that changed the world. And if we're being fair here, he did accomplish all 3 of those. I mean, seriously, the vast majority of people alive in 1492 are unknown to history. It's almost as though they never existed. Yet here we are talking about Columbus in the year 2020, where he's become a household name. That there is what we call immortality. And now we get to the bad. Now, this isn't going to be a very fun segment here, folks, so I'm warning you ahead of time. During his 4 voyages, Columbus took a lot of prisoners as slaves. We're talking tens of thousands. And there's even a letter from one of his friends where he writes that Columbus gave him a local Carib girl as a gift, and that the friend had tried to have his way with her, but she resisted, so he beat her with a rope until she was willing to do anything he wanted. He enslaved a lot of people, and he treated these slaves very badly. The crown started hearing complaints about how Columbus and his 2 brothers were running things, so a replacement was sent, Francisco de Bobadilla, and he almost immediately set out to investigate what the hell was going on halfway around the world. According to his official report that he presented to the crown after interviews with people that both did and did not support Columbus, yeah, even his supporters saw his use of power as tyrannical. Under Columbus's rule, extremely harsh punishments were used, such as punishing a man for stealing corn by cutting off his ears and nose, then selling him into slavery, punishing a woman for speaking of Columbus as being of low birth by having her paraded through the streets naked, then cutting out her tongue. If the natives began to show symptoms of unrest, well, they were all killed, dismembered, and their body parts paraded through the streets as a warning. Public whippings and hangings were common for many infractions, and the trade market for 9 and 10-year-old girls as sex slaves flourished. Plus, the gold mines were run horrifically, under conditions worse than what you're probably imagining. He was also accused of intentionally not baptizing natives because then they couldn't be used as slaves. Again, these are all from reports from both his opponents and those that defended him. I cannot say with 100% certainty how much of it is true, but there's a decent amount of evidence to say that most likely, most of it, if not all of it, is likely true. Now, full disclosure here, the report was compiled by a man who was gunning for Columbus's job, and it would have behooved him to make Columbus look as bad as possible, so we have to keep that in mind. But man, that report. It was enough that Columbus was arrested, stripped of his titles, and sent back to Europe in chains. He and his 2 brothers were in prison for about 6 months before being released. Columbus ended up going on a 4th voyage shortly after. In 1506, at the age of 54, Columbus died in Castile, probably from either a bacterial infection in his stomach or a venereal disease. His remains interred, then removed, then interred, then moved again several occasions until finally finding his final resting place in Seville, Spain, after being moved from Havana, Cuba after the Spanish-American War. So basically, was Columbus a good person? Not really. Is he one of the most important men in the history of humanity? You betcha. Oh, and one last thing, as far as that whole the earth is flat thing, by Columbus's time it was pretty much well known that the earth was in fact round for over 1,000 years. You're sadly going to find more people today that believe the earth is flat than in 1492. Progress.